So hello, Sargon Nisan. You're the IMF project manager at Reikurs, which is an NGO. You're not the IMF project manager, just for our viewers and listeners to be informed. But you are well-researched, well-informed about the IMF, and you've been tackling the issue of the IMF for some years now. And that's why I want to begin this interview with you by asking a question concerning the IMF as an institution, as a whole. There is lots of polarization, it seems, not only in Lebanon, in many places in the world. Whenever the IMF is in the public discussion, either it's the bad guy in the room or the good guy in the room, but more so about the ideology, let's say, of the IMF or its policies, where it's generally disdained by some while applauded by many. If you want to begin with an overview, a historical overview about the IMF as an institution, did it change with the years or not? Or some of the aspects of the IMF changed and some didn't? What can we say about the history of the IMF?
Thank you, Jed. Yes, it's definitely true that I do not work for the IMF. I'm a long-term watcher of the IMF. So, though I don't know if anybody has been around long enough, because of course it was founded along with its sister organization, the World Bank, in 1944. So this is an institution in its 70s, and it has, like most people in their 70s, lived different lives and played different roles as the world has changed around it. So its original function that it was founded to do is to be a sort of credit club, the sort of thing that it's not a bank. And this is a really important understanding that we should always keep in mind. It is a club of countries. It's a member organization, and together they each put in a share, though not the same amount. And this is to preserve financial stability and economic cooperation. And you can guess why this was a priority when it was founded, because a lot of people saw the instability of the Great Depression in the 1920s as one of the causes of the Second World War. So this is, I think, the dictionary definition. And what's the reality? Well, it's changed a lot since then, and maybe it never was that. But I think you describe a highly polarized debate about the role of the IMF, and you said, I think rightly, that this is not restricted to one place, Lebanon alone, but in many instances. And of course, I come from a critical perspective. My work in the NGO sector has usually been to support people in countries where the IMF is active to challenge the role and impact of the IMF. So, you and your viewers should be conscious of where my bias lies. But I think it's fair to say that, the IMF is often a very polarizing institution, and it comes at times of great crisis because it is there to lend only if a country has no other source of investment or lending, and it won't lend unless that's the case. And of course, that is the case for Lebanon. So I think, what does this polarization say to me? Well, I think it's actually like a lot of things that are black and white, probably there's shades of gray. And while I'm critical, I do think it's important that we open up a little bit how it works. And I think the first thing I would say about that polarization is that the actual role the IMF often plays is like a shield for the creditors, the people ultimately, the countries ultimately that provide the lending capital. So that's the rich countries. And it's a straw man for borrowers. A straw man is an English idiom, which is a false enemy. And why do I say that? Because many times the terms and conditions that countries say are imposed upon them by the IMF are really a product of a negotiation between the IMF and the borrower. And the borrower has some power and influence through various ways, which we can go into, not in terms of the situation overall, but in terms of determining who bears the biggest burden in fixing it. And if a country has decided that they have no other option but to go to the IMF. And these choices can be really fundamental and are often the most controversial. For example, choosing between reducing support for education or healthcare or social protection versus supporting private businesses and keeping taxes low on richer people. I think we can all see why those would be highly controversial and very appealing to blame on the IMF, even if actually in some political environments we can see that these are more complex pictures. So I think this is actually the role the IMF has evolved to play, and it's useful that there's another actor, and it confuses the picture. And the countries that provide the IMF's capital and have the biggest voting power and can take decisions in the IMF are European and above all the United States. So this role to be, if you like, a slightly useful diversion, an intermediary, a punching bag, all at the same time, is partly what the IMF is there for. It is as much a political institution as a technical one.
We'll get into this aspect because it's an interesting and complex aspect of the way the IMF is built. But you mentioned that the negotiation between the IMF and the borrower is the basis upon which any program is usually made of. But the question would be, what are the balances of power between, what is the balance of power between the country and the IMF when a country is in the first place reaching out to the IMF because it has either an insolvency or a big economic and financial problem? Is there any balance between the government of a country and the IMF as an institution?
Usually no. And the answer, and the reason I say that is because, like you said, when a country chooses, how much is it a choice? It is a choice made by necessity. Lebanon is not the only country whose, though its situation is pretty extreme, who has had to confront it's the last option, and it's designed to be. So when a country negotiates with the IMF, the first thing, and this can be probably the first of many times I say this to complicate this picture, is that the IMF is an institution which has many thousands of staff, dedicated teams in regional departments with country teams, whose job is to be specialists in negotiation and monitoring of any country. Plus, they have departments on many different topics and research. All of this comes together, but is below the decision-making level. Yeah. And that decision-making level has representatives of those countries that have the most money, the biggest economies in the world, and that's deliberate. That is the structure. And I think one of the first things that we should probably help viewers to understand is how this interaction takes place. It's not just two negotiators, it's very many. And lots of that happens behind the scenes. Why? Well, the IMF wants to present itself as a technical institution where everybody agrees, because if it was a technical problem alone, then you call the technical expert. If it's like it's like having a problem with your, heating or electricity at home, you call an engineer. Yeah. And pretending, however, that these questions are purely technical is partly how the IMF has power, and so people are told, you have no choice. And but I want to just break open the idea that it's just an institution with a huge consensus. That's not true. Actually, the staff, they do have ideology, and we have seen this over many years towards a market system, but it's also a useful ideology because the powerful countries that ultimately take the decisions like, do we lend to this country or yes or no, the core fundamental decisions, they have the companies that are being protected in many ways. And we saw this even in richer countries, such as the European crisis over the last decade in Greece and other places, where really what the IMF insured, who the IMF insured was repaid. Who had been lending to Greece? Who were they? They were German and French banks. Which were the countries on the board that had the biggest influence over what the IMF did and said? Well, in this case, France and Germany were very active. So
and
that's,
here there is, yeah,
that's how
there's
that
a point that one can point to with the example of Greece, because then the IMF and the Eurogroup in general said always that a debt is a debt and you have to pay your debt. Even though everyone, experts and politicians alike, had some sort of a consensus internally in Greece that such a big debt is unpayable. However, because Deutsche Bank and BNP Paribas were the lenders, so the debt was repaid to the German and French banks. Why do we see that in the Lebanese case, a debt isn't a debt? As far as we hear till now from the IMF, it seems that there is like an approval by the IMF that yes, your debt is not sustainable. You cannot pay it. You have to have a big haircut on it.
That's a really good point. And I think this is where comparing the origin and the evolution of the IMF to where it is now is really important. And Christine Lagarde, the previous managing director and now the president of the European Central Bank, the former finance minister of France, before these international appointments, said this is not your grandparents' IMF. And she said this at a time of the European crisis because she was critical of, communities like my own, always criticizing the IMF for having a, if you like, neoliberal, or sometimes people use the term Washington consensus, but essentially an ideological and political bias, that it acts purely on behalf of certain interests and within a framework of ideology. And her claim was that they were learning lessons and they were changing. My personal view is that's only partially true. And I think the example you give is one of the better examples of where substantive and change in terms of the technical positions and the ideological positions they imply have changed. And that's to do with unsustainable debt. But it's only partially changed. For example, Lebanon's debt is a fraction of what was owed eventually by Greece. It's a fraction. So first of all, I think there's some practicality here about, Lebanon restructuring its debt isn't going to create systemic financial crisis globally. So they can afford to be more less ideological. But also the criticism, and the IMF underwent, I would say probably the peak of this was in 2007, an existential crisis. And the reason was that during the period of boom up to around before the global financial crisis, and remember 2008 was when the American bank Lehman Brothers went bust. And this existential crisis was almost that, look back now, the naivety of those times, argument that of many people in mainstream economics and politics that the era of crisis was over. And there was an expectation that the IMF, which is self-funded through its lending, was not sustainable. In fact, there were budget cuts for the first time. People were losing their jobs. And these are, pretty great jobs. You get a very generous salary and tax-free, and your kids, if you're in Washington, these are highly educated people. They are usually PhDs in macroeconomics. They are from the global elite. And so this was a shocking existential crisis. But very soon the IMF was needed again, because it wasn't the end of history. It wasn't the end of boom and bust. And we learned that financial crises are still a problem. So I think the lessons of that period, in particular the political pain and scrutiny that they underwent during the global financial crisis, has led to a greater pragmatism. And I would point to a number of things. One, a move away from the Washington consensus to a more institutional and mixed view of how the economy works, to longer termism in the way the IMF is engaging. And that actually is very worrying because it's not structured to be long-term. It's not accountable for long-term decisions and so on. So we can go into that. But certainly on a few areas of real importance to Lebanon, one you mentioned, debt sustainability, and another that I would flag, which is an openness to capital controls, or what they term capital management. Because, of course, Lebanon is a form of regional financial center, and capital flight, inflows and remittances are hugely important. So I think this is partly the IMF confronting a degree of reality, but also having more space to be more honest in these unsustainable situations. I can point to other situations right now where they're not being so honest. Argentina, for example, which is, I think, represents $1 in $4 ever borrowed from the IMF because of its scale. And so, it is a mixed picture.
So some things change, some other things don't change. Depends on the political and geopolitical situation and the economic situation of each country. I have several questions here. You mentioned that capital control is one of the points that usually the IMF in the past didn't push for or didn't ask for. Is that what you meant by now? Yes. In Lebanon, they are asking for that? Oh, okay. Just clarifying this point.
I can go into that a little bit more, but carry on.
Yeah, no, let's talk about this issue because I have a follow-up question on the positioning of Lebanon versus Greece as an example to be made. But let's talk about the capital control issue because it's always a big issue in Lebanon.
I think capital controls is another good example, like debt sustainability or levels of debt, whether they can be repaid, no matter what the political cost of creditors like BNP Paribas or Deutsche Bank not being repaid. And I think capital controls is similar because it also is a situation where ideology confronts reality. And what changed was a decade ago, just over, during the acute financial crisis globally, that, let's not forget, came from big financial systems of the world's biggest economies. The practical reality, especially for significant economies around the world, was that there was an economic crisis being imported into their economies that they did not create, they were not responsible for, did not reflect a problem with their economy, but was simply a vulnerability. And I'm talking about countries that are very rich and whose policies exactly conform to the free market ideology associated with the IMF. Switzerland, Chile, Brazil. And you saw these countries who have the economic freedom. They weren't, asking the IMF for loans. So they had the policy freedom to say, no, we actually are going to impose some form of capital control because money streaming out of our economy because banks somewhere else need it suddenly and we're a good, easy, quick source is not helpful and healthy nor fair if it suddenly exposes our financial system. So it was like this huge sucking, like a vacuum cleaner of these banks who suddenly realized they had holes in their balance sheets and they decided to fill them by pulling money out of other countries. And we're not talking poor countries, we're talking the one of the most developed in Latin America, we're talking Switzerland, so I don't think there needs any comparison there. So the capital management term is a reflection of a slight different geopolitical outcome and the reality of what totally open financial systems creates, which is instability.
Yeah.
So
in Lebanon, when the collapse began, you had the politicians refusing to impose capital controls because we have a free economy and we cannot just put restrictions on the economy. So there's some hypocrisy usually when this question becomes a local question. But when you talk about Switzerland or now even Russia is imposing capital controls, it's not about the free economy as a concept, but as a result of capital flight that you need to manage. So if you're saying that the IMF is doesn't have any specific now point that it adheres to ideologically, it balances each case by its own. My question was that the irony would be, or maybe you can explain this issue. One can say that if the geopolitical strength of the country or its economic impact outside its borders is higher, its balance of power with the IMF should be higher because it impacts more than its own economy. It's not Lebanon. It's, let's say, Germany. If Germany is in trouble, so the whole Euro group and the whole world might be in trouble. How come that in the case of Lebanon, we see that the IMF is a little bit lenient, that we can say lenient, like accepting that the debt is unsustainable and accepting the idea of capital controls. But in the case of Greece, where it has a bigger power or a bigger impact than Lebanon on the euro as a whole, it was tougher. It shouldn't be the other case around.
No, I think this is, I mean, I'm smiling because you've asked me such a difficult question for which I'm not sure that I've seen anybody have a compelling answer. What I would say is that I don't think your characterization is totally true in the sense that the IMF has abandoned ideological value. No, the ideology is still there. And if you look at where, and you can see this in reports from its own independent valuation office, which only exists because of the scale of the failure in the Argentina loan 20 years ago, one of the many leading up to today. But in terms of your specific question then, why is it willing to be lenient to Lebanon? I do think it is partly pragmatism. I do think it is to do with the chronic scale of Lebanon's challenges. But Lebanon is an unusual economy, and there are other examples around the world, I think, where there is of this sort of regional financial center function, so that it's not similar to the countries with whom it has often most economic interactions. What I think is important to understand, though, is the pandemic. In the last 2 years, roughly, of the pandemic, the IMF made over $100 billion available to almost 90 countries. And most of this money was provided under new lending, new types of loan. And those are new in the last 10 years. Why were they created? Because of how badly the global financial crisis exposed the IMF's approaches, how limited they were. And the example of Greece and how, you know, the IMF was saying one thing and the whole world, no, you didn't need a PhD in economics to see that it was not true. And they themselves knew it. What's a separate, really interesting question is how the IMF has a long history of being able to have many, many faces and say different things at the same time, depending on who is saying it and to what purpose. And I think this is what the whole point of what I'm trying to say is that the IMF is almost like, it's like the parliament building for countries. It's where the negotiations happen, but they pretend it's not. They pretend it's just the engineers faculty and they're there, you know, fixing the economy with their instruments. So I think the special the incongruousness, if I may say that what's unusual that you pick out is also to do with the last 2 years. We succeeded, as I think global community, journalists, and so on, of saying the IMF's ideological lending under these fixed structures of loans, which are very short-term and very extreme and focused entirely on repayment, was not suited, and that was really obvious a decade ago. So now with the pandemic, the IMF used these new tools it developed in response to that criticism to defend itself. And quite frankly, Lebanon is a drop in this ocean of money.
Yeah.
And actually, there's almost like an opportunity for a reset. Like if you play a video game and you just start over and you get a free life for the IMF. Why? Because they can wash away in this huge crisis a lot of the contradictions and give countries the opportunity to restart, restart their engine, because it's like a collective stalling of the engine of the economy for everyone. So I think that there is local factors to Lebanon, some long-term factors about how the IMF is changing, but also some very short-term recent factors which have combined for this situation.
Before I ask you some questions about the political engineering of the IMF, you tackled it a little bit before, but you mentioned something about the different tools that now the IMF is dealing with, like having a longer term approach to the problems, and even may have some longer term programs. I'm not sure if that occurs or with what you said, that it's against the IMF structure and what it was supposed to do. What did you mean by this contradiction here?
Mm-hmm. I mentioned that when the IMF was founded, it was founded alongside the World Bank. Both institutions were founded at the same moment, the end of the Second World War, and the bank is a bank. It has multiple facets, and it's actually many institutions, but at its core is a bank which invests long-term, and its mission was reconstruction, and now has evolved into development. The IMF is not that. The IMF is to stop situations like the one Lebanon finds itself in, and as soon as the situation is restabilized, to allow the country itself, and maybe with the support of the World Bank, to grow. So if you like, the IMF is sort of like the emergency room in the hospital, and the World Bank was more like, not just the health system, but the schooling and so on. The IMF was there to stop the heart attack, or to prevent it. And this is now beginning to change. And it's to do with probably a reaction to the criticism it's received, especially in its existential crisis over the last 20 years and its legitimacy crisis over the last 10, for this strange period of being told it was irrelevant to suddenly critical again. So the implication is this, and perhaps we in civil society like myself need to be self-critical about what we are doing. And that is to say, we have made some successes. We criticized austerity and the IMF's role for the last 25 years in the Asian financial crisis, in the Russian financial crisis, and in its impact and the legacy it's left. The consequence is that the IMF has begun to, over the last 7 years, acknowledge and now it says address issues like inequality, including gender inequality, climate change, social protection, which covers a lot of different aspects from, of social services. And in a way, and with a very recent thing, which is going to be announced very shortly, and which Lebanon could well be a candidate to receive funding, is a new trust. In August of last year, the IMF finalized a process which approved by its membership to increase something called the SDR, which is the internal IMF currency. And this created $650 billion. But it was shared. It's like the bank increasing its capital.
Yeah, we had our share, about $1 billion.
And yes, and I checked, and you used it, I think, immediately to repay existing loans.
No, they used it just to stabilize the exchange rate.
Yes.
So,
yes, and the reality of how the IMF is structured and its decision-making reflects this fact of quota, of each country's share in the IMF, reflects how much power it has in votes, and this is also determines how big your piece of the pie was of this SDR allocation, which, as you said, Lebanon used to repay loans. No, excuse me, I said that. to sustain its exchange rate. Regardless, that means that 2/3 of that $650 billion stayed with the richest countries. And there's now discussions, and we expect to see something by April announced formally, of a resilience and sustainability trust, which will be a trust managed by the IMF to receive some of these rich countries extra cash that they received much more, but only as loans, and to provide loans to countries which already have an IMF program. So that would be Lebanon if a loan is agreed and a process is agreed. And that would be to augment the country's capacity. And it's really, it's learning from this improvised approach that occurred over the last couple of years in the pandemic. What's really worrying to us in civil society is that this is clearly something needed, but $50 billion to maybe 100 countries potentially, it's really not a lot over 10 years. And the Barbados Prime Minister said that the Glasgow COP meetings of the climate negotiations in December, she said, let's not forget that quantitative easing by rich countries was over $17 trillion.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, compared to 50 billion, it's just not even close. And that's, yeah, one time, I can't even do in my head the math for that. It's just, yeah, it's a lot. It's hundreds of times. So what this is already pointing to is these factors where the IMF is looking at these structural aspects of the economy, like inequality, but also what it's always looked at structurally, like markets and competition and the role of private capital. It's almost expanding its footprint. And with this new trust of 50 billion, it will formalize the role to have loans that go on for 10 or 20 years. I think that they were looking at having 10-year loans that only need to be repaid after 10 years. This is much more like the idea of a bank. This is much more like the idea of an institution that is shaping generations' future. And the IMF, and then maybe we can go into this last, is not structured to be accountable to the even democracies which are its members. And it's not just democracies which are its members. So the IMF is becoming an institution very much at the heart of setting what is permitted. And when it comes to something like, say, climate change or long-term growth decisions, that means it's sort of in a position to act like the gatekeeper, saying this is how much is permitted to do this, how much equality you're allowed to have, how much you can try and commit to climate change and adaptation and perhaps mitigation, though I think in Lebanon's case, you know, it's hardly a significant emitter. So this is a really profound change in the institution, and it's very, very far from being accountable to, you know, people like you, let alone your representatives, even whether you feel represented by them or not.
Yeah. Interesting. My last question would be about the political makeup of the IMF. It's obvious that the makeup, the shares that each country has dependent on its quota is already political, because one can see that Japan has more share than China, which doesn't reflect the size of the economy, but it reflects a political standpoint. How can a country feel this political orientation of the IMF? Because one can easily say, okay, it's an American tool, but it's a more complex issue than just being an American direct tool for foreign policy. How can a country like Lebanon feel this political makeup?
Good question. It helps to understand how the decision-making happens. And I already described the fact that the institution has a professional staff that is very, very large, but it has a board that is 24 people. 8 represent their home country and nobody else. UK, France, Germany, United States, China, Russia. And the other board members, that would leave 16, represent groups of countries or constituencies. African countries, for example, have 2 constituencies. 45, I think, countries are covered by 2 people, who's usually appointed by the country with the biggest quota share. The IMF makes no major decisions, cannot make a major decision unless 85% of the voting quotas are agreed. The United States alone has enough to block any decision as a result.
They have 16%.
Precisely, and that's less than their economic footprint globally. But they've given their extra, because once you have enough to block, you don't need any extra. In regular reform processes, which every time, instead of taking 5 years, take a bit longer. So now I think we're several cycles behind where we need to be because of the inherently political nature that you described. For example, I believe that the technical calculation is, it's a formula which is designed when you have the answer first, not the opposite way around. And why? Because, for example, you always have these features, not just as like what you described about Japan, but France and the UK are almost have the exact same outcome. And it's meant to calculate not just economic size, but how integrated you are in the world economy and other factors like this. So the other critical factor to understand about these unequal board members, and there really is a lack of equality between them, is that they are executive directors. The managing director, currently Kristalina Georgieva, which is always a European for old historical reasons that don't have any basis in sort of technical merit, she chairs the board, but the executive board members make decisions. This is not non-executives. This is not the institution having the final word. It is its shareholders having the final word. It is not run like a corporation where the chief executive, is usually the boss, but rather it is the shareholders. And that's the term they use themselves. So when a country like Lebanon confronts this institution, it is negotiating with many different people, sometimes indirectly. First of all, it needs to find an acceptable route forward that the staff will endorse. But it needs to know immediately, at the same time, quite frankly, that there is enough consensus at the board level that what the country wants and what they hope to convince the staff is acceptable will be acceptable to the board. All of this can be accompanied by bilateral conversations, including with the United States and other allies, to make your case. And how I understand these negotiations occur is often a lot of this corridor negotiation. Why corridor? Because it's not public.
Yeah.
The reason it may seem strange that I talk so much about this voting power, because very rarely does the board vote. In fact, it's this core contradiction that I wanted to highlight. The board doesn't vote because it's so important to present decisions as a consensus, because that's more consistent with it being a technical institution. Yeah. So it's highly politicized and extremely risky to disagree. For example, the Brazilian executive director during the Greece crisis, who'd spoken quite articulately and angrily, this is under the Lula administration, not the current administration, about the injustice of providing so many resources. Huge numbers were being provided to Greece and other countries in the Eurozone from the IMF. And yet, for pennies relative to this, countries in the global south had huge transformations of their economies effectively imposed upon them.
Yeah, in order to be accepted.
Yeah, and as a result, this particular director abstained during one of the meetings that was meant to be a rubber stamp. And he wasn't director for very long, especially when the governments changed, put it that way. But the importance of understanding the functional power within the institution is really, I can't emphasize. However, how the institution presents itself often obscures, it masks how that process works, and there's a very deliberate choice in that. And I think this is why I can say the IMF is doing the opposite in different settings. Why? Because it's internally a place where different departments can disagree, where different countries are pushing for different outcomes at the board, and they're negotiating. So it's almost like the place where they talk it over. And the rest of us, citizens and civil society, often don't have any access to that. And that's really where I feel it is a really illegitimate and problematic institution, and why, you know, I've spent my work doing what I do. That doesn't mean economic problems like Lebanon has and confronts aren't serious or real. It's just that we would need, I think, it's long overdue that we had support to countries in a genuinely more open and solidarity-based way. And we can see that when geopolitics overcomes the sort of ideological, or when the crisis is so acute that these simple, safe solutions that work for them but not for anybody else are themselves become redundant.
I said that it was the last question. I lied. There are
Only
two more questions. Yeah, just small questions, and maybe the latter one can be a long question, but just a small clarification. Usually, when a country has a program with the IMF, usually it doesn't. It's not the rule, but usually during a crisis, a country has several IMF programs. That's right. So
it's certainly very common, and some countries have a chronic relationship. If I can use my health or illness metaphor again, it is a chronic relationship with the IMF. And in effect, my point about how it's somehow new, the IMF is becoming more long-term and structural, that's a little bit untrue, because in a way, when you look at its relationship to certain countries, and Pakistan, for example, which has recently had I think it's 13 loans in 30 years, and usually the loans are for 3 years. So 13, I mean, how can that work out? Or
it's recurrent.
And many of the loans themselves carry the last ones into them. And we mentioned Argentina as well, and a mix of factors. And, you know, immediately you can think Argentina is not an insignificant state. It's large. It's G20 member. In Pakistan, for lots of geopolitical reasons, is a state. Perhaps Turkey is another example, more close to Lebanon in regional terms, and maybe many of your viewers will be more familiar with its recent history, that it also has this characteristic. And of course, the IMF becomes very hated and very well known. I think in the elections in Argentina, you've had campaign slogans saying, you know, thanks to me, your kids don't know what the letters IMF stand for. And that was an Argentine campaign broadcast, saying we haven't had them here for at least 10, 15 years. So this quality of repeat loans, I suspect, and if you look at how much it's happened, is something the IMF themselves know very well, and probably internalize, in terms of saying, we want to, we will accept only X, Y, Z in terms of degrees of cuts, fiscal or economic targets that cause so much hardship. But they may not, but they may well be, and this is me speculating, well aware that that's not politically possible. And maybe another government or two down the line is finally going to get there, and the IMF is just going to keep pushing. And why is it the IMF doing that? Because the board has decided that's acceptable. In a country with nuclear weapons like Pakistan, maybe they've often said, no, we'll close the eyes to this and we'll waive that. You know what I mean? Because there's obvious other considerations that the major shareholders have. And I think we've seen that in the last decade in places like North Africa and Egypt, in particular, where the IMF's usual stringency was not quite as apparent. And my suspicion is, you know, or that it's a part of this bigger pattern that many have documented academically, and even the IMF's own independent evaluation office has talked about, problems of, overly optimistic forecasts of its own deals and so on, which means that it pretends like it didn't know they would be back at the negotiating table in short time.
My last question is about an example that you told me about in our previous conversation. It was recorded, but it was interesting to me, and maybe one can elaborate on when you were trying to think of some cases with some similarities to Lebanon, and you had the example of Ukraine. And
but we spoke before the recent invasion.
Before,
so just for the benefit. Yeah,
not related to what's happening now. But we didn't elaborate on the issue back then, so it's an interesting point, especially now that we hear a lot of Ukraine for all the other reasons, but one can maybe understand the idea.
I mean, when you asked me what's a similar case to Lebanon, and we've talked today about all of these unusual and almost peculiar aspects where the IMF normally imposes a standard and strict austerity driven platform so that financial savings are prioritized and spending on social needs are usually deprioritized. But we see some exceptions to this, or a more complex picture, at least in terms of, for example, I think a very recent blog on the IMF about Lebanon, which I would encourage your viewers to look at. You just need to put IMF Lebanon into your search engine, and you'll see the most recent blogs. And so they're talking about the progress in negotiations, and I think these characteristics you say that are surprising, or at least incongruous, are present. And the reason I said Ukraine was a similar example was because of the previous history of Ukraine following its social revolution in 2014. And what followed was a particularly unusual set of circumstances, which rings a bell. That is to say, the struggle between very significant economic interests, many of whom popularly were viewed as corrupt and integrated with certain political factions, versus a growing popular will to confront them, created a very unusual situation where the IMF in 2014, almost because of how unusual Ukraine was, it was always talking about it, because it was providing quite a significant and often, to my ears, surprising and new and different level of support to transparency and structural changes in Ukraine, which, speaking to Ukrainian activists and civil society, they really endorsed. Now, often the IMF says lots of positive things, and the people who really endorse it aren't civil society in the way that I would see it. They might be business people and chambers of commerce and so on who say, great, love what the IMF is saying. But that's not the kind of people I mean in this instance. And so what made me feel that there was a parallel was simply that a very unusual geopolitical situation in Ukraine up to the overthrow of the previous president, and this popular desire, and the fact that that popular desire in this case happened to be sympathetic to the major shareholders of the IMF. So that's a very convenient, but it was a real alignment. And that gave the IMF as an institution the freedom, because it knew it had the backing at the top, to really commit and give a lot more breathing space to Ukraine as a borrower country, as a highly vulnerable country, as a fragile country. And I think that this is one of the situations with Lebanon, though I think there's some important differences. It's not that Lebanon has the same benign perception from the IMF's major shareholders as Ukraine did in 2014 and subsequently, but rather there is, I think, a realization that the extent and of the political stalemate, the instability of successive governments, the need for physical reconstruction, the proximity and the presence of conflict in Lebanon for many years, and the extraordinary burden of refugees that Lebanon has taken on. These are all factors that you cannot credibly claim are because of poor economic decisions, you know?
Yeah.
And so for different reasons, perhaps, and because the Lebanon's scale of need on a global level is not significant, I think provides a degree of breathing room for Lebanon that doesn't really reflect what a debate that is purely polarized from it's all bad or it's all good. At the end of the day, the Lebanese representatives, the government will at one point have to make choices, because a highly financialized economy like Lebanon's is unable to restart without making certain choices and cuts. And I note the IMF still points to things like the energy sector and significant financial sector reform. And those terms are very open and ambiguous, and those could be highly progressive, if you will, but they could be also highly toxic and negative. It really is, but I do think it is up for grabs. And that's, I think, not always been the case when small, poor countries confront the IMF. A better outcome is possible.
Thanks a lot for this enlightening discussion, such wide-ranging cases that we looked for and asked you for. So thanks a lot, Saigon Nisan, and hopefully a couple of months or years from now, we will meet again and we can talk about what's really happening with the IMF, if Lebanon at one point was able to have its own program, and then we can assess.
Yeah, well, which is the right course, I certainly don't know. Obviously, you're well aware how often IMF programs are not a good sign and lead to just yet more suffering. But yeah, I certainly hope for the best for you, your country. I know Lebanon well and have been to Beirut many times, and hopefully we can do that meeting in person.
Hopefully. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.